All right, I would like to ask Greg to start coming forward. Greg Butler manages the Southern Australian No-Till Farmers Association, which is one of Australia's largest non-profit land management organizations focused on improved productivity through the development and deployment of superior farm technologies. Now, Greg is I've got to realize over this past week that he has a lot going up here, and he's got very much a number of interesting projects going on that he does development work for his farmers group. I'm not going to say too much. You've all read his history or the little piece that we gave out with the program, and then I hope that you actually see where we might be going through what he's telling you. Some of the things that he's going to say might be out there, if I read him correctly, but we like to challenge everyone. So without further ado, Greg, the floor is yours.
Okay, Braai dankie for having us here today. That's the extent of my Afrikaans. But look, where we are, I guess we're in an organisation that we have people who have rocks and have desert and have mud and all these different environments. And everyone's farming system these days is very different. And so I guess our approach is that, we just try to put it out there and people can take or leave it as they see fit. But just to pick up on the introduction, I guess my job within SANTFA is just to keep on knocking down doors, seeing what is 5 years or 10 years or 20 years ahead of us, and how as a collective of farmers we can not only just improve our farms, but our businesses and our whole communities together. So I just want to share with you today probably 5 or 6 snapshots, and just the time I've got, I won't be able to go into heaps of detail for all of them, but hopefully you can see some of the things we're trying to do. The image here is faba beans, and you can see here these guys are trying just to retain as much stubble as they can all the time. In terms of adoption of no-till, if we look here, you see back in 2005, so that's 10 years ago now, we're at 75% adoption, so 3/4 of it's done. And at that stage, people said, well, what do we do? But now we're busier than ever. But the thing about it, I guess, is that some of the mindset gets caught up in the paddock, how well the crop's going to grow. But some of the major driving forces for the adoption of no-till and zero-till have been other things, like, for example, the ability to sow more acres inside the sowing window. And therefore, those farmers that have adopted those technologies have been those that have been able to expand their businesses by taking on more acres. And it hasn't been the conventional work it up, work it back, pre-drill sow guys that have been able to expand their businesses because they can't take on more acres. So I guess sometimes when we were at the tour yesterday, just one thing that crossed my mind is the comparison between the conventional, the no-till, the zero-till and the min-till, is they're all sown at the same time. But if you're putting in 2,000 hectares, they're not sown at the same time. So you just need to look beyond some of the actual stuff in the field, think about the land asset, and that you're actually in a real estate business as well, and things like, for example, getting economy of scale doesn't always come from just being bigger, because in a farming system you're limited by your seeder and your capacity. And economy of scale comes out of timeliness and getting over the ground quicker, for example, and things like that. So I guess timeliness can provide productivity benefits. In our systems, particularly in drier years, we know that time of sowing is arguably the most important, irrespective of how that's sown, no-till, zero-till, but the time of sowing is what really produces yield. So I guess the point I also wanted to make was that in Australia, unlike US farmers and European farmers, there is no subsidies. So we're out there on our own. There is no sympathy vote. Oh, we've got rocks, or we've got a drought, any of those sort of things. We've got to make it work, because the sympathy vote are the guys that end up getting bought out by those that are more aggressive and adopting new practices. And that's the way the world runs, whether you like it or not, I guess. So I'm going to talk about a few things, and some of these I've sort of spoken about a little bit over the last few days. Disc seeding, which seems to be something that's coming on here. Soil moisture monitoring, which has been huge. Soil moisture monitoring has been around in irrigation for over 20 years, but over the last 5 years in broadacre farming in Australia, it has really taken off. And originally people said, why would we want to monitor soil moisture? We don't irrigate. But I tell you what, the cultivars we plant, how we manage our nitrogen applications, and in a deregulated grain market, how we avoid price spreads by knowing where our moisture is and how we're going to market our grain relative to things like pinch grain and things like that have become, it's really become one of the major tools of the trade. And Tom will show in his farming operation how he's actually utilising that. Another thing I think which is universal across English and Afrikaans is the word snake oil, and I'm going to talk about a little one called Biochar. We have evaluated 1,000,001 brews in a bottle type of things, lots of snake oils over the years on behalf of our members. But Biochar one is one that seems to be working well for us, so I'll show you some results there, but it can be very hit and miss, and I try to explain why that is. I'm going to talk a little bit about high pressure water jet cutting and how we want to deploy that to the field, some stuff about biomass to energy, and phosphate recovery if we have time. So I'll just start hoeing straight into it. Here's just a picture of a disc. Here's the ground level, and here's the size of the disc. Now, if we take a tangent from the middle of the disc to the soil, that tangent there is at 90 degrees. What we want our disc to be is about 45 degrees, that angle there. We have two cutting forces in a disc. If you imagine just holding the disc and shearing it through the ground, that's one of the cutting forces, and the other one is the actual rotation of the disc going around and round. Both of those cutting forces are maximised when it's at 45 degrees. If we look here, we see this one. It's too far, it's too deep. This one's pretty good, and this one's too shallow. Okay, so if we're going to put a seed into the ground at a certain like wheat, we want it in at a certain depth, then disc size is pretty important. Because if we have, for example, too small a disc, we're going to have to dig that in too deep to achieve that same depth. If we have a disc that is far too big, we're going to be too shallow and we're not going to achieve that angle. So what tends to happen is this turns into a mess. It bulldozes up all the stuff, it uses a lot of horsepower and rips in the ground. This cuts really well and puts the seed in at about the right height. But this often with bigger discs, when you're too shallow on that angle, there's too much of the downforce. And what you find is as you go through, particularly as your soils get softer and you have more and more stubble, it hairpins. Okay? So it's very important. There are other reasons why some people would want a smaller disc or a bigger disc. But for example, for sowing wheat depth, we feel that 16 to 17 inches is about the right size of a disc that will give you the right wheat depth and give you that 45 degrees. Okay? If you do have rocks, yeah, go a little bit bigger. But don't, if you're going to go smaller or bigger in your disc size, really question yourself why you're going to be moving away from that angle. Because if you're moving away from that angle, you're going to be reducing your stubble management capacity. And at the end of the day, you're moving to a disc because of stubble management capacity. Another little thing is good design. This is a coulter, and you can see this coulter here. Hopefully everyone can still hear me okay. This coulter here, it's a traditional fluted coulter. If you imagine, I don't know if you have corrugated iron, and you go to a sand pit and you push the corrugated iron straight in, it goes in. But if you put that corrugated iron at 45 degrees and try to push that in, you're pushing against the sidewall. You've significantly increased the surface area trying to push through, and it doesn't go in anywhere near as well. And so often, some of these coulters that are just straight radial coulters, you can see where that's going to intercept the soil, actually is going to be pressing on this underside of that sidewall there. And it's going to be creating a lot more soil disturbance. It's going to require a lot more downforce to get into the ground. This is called a tangential coulter. And you see here that the flutes of the coulter are not running from the centre outwards. They're actually on an angle. And what it means, though, is that at 45 degree tangent, it's almost like the galvanised going straight into the sandpit, okay? And so you significantly reduce the amount of downforce required, the horsepower, all those sort of things, and the soil disturbance to get that job done, and the ability to cut through. So to cast the steel in that costs no more to cast the steel in that. So when you're thinking about those things, small design changes can actually make quite a big difference to the operation. All right, let's move on from that. Now I'm going to talk about soil moisture, and unfortunately I'm going to just give you a quick little lesson in chemistry, because if you really want to understand water, you need to understand water. Now, H2O is water, oxygen with two hydrogens. They come together and they form water. What's important about this is that different atoms have different amount of gravity for what's called electrons. Electrons are the little moons that go around. And it's no different to a moon going around the Earth, going around the sun. There's wheels within wheels. But basically what happens is that this electron here around hydrogen goes around and around. But when it joins up to oxygen, oxygen has so much more gravity than hydrogen that the electrons spend most of their time around there. The reason that's important is that electrons are negatively charged. And so if we actually map the surface of water for its polarity, its negative and positive charge, we see the hydrogen part here is positives and the oxygen part there is negative. So you can think about water being like a million little magnets in a bag. And if you did have a million little magnets in a bag, you'd see they'd sort of stick and they'd flow and you could sort of pour them out. And what happens is that water holds itself together by the positive to the negative to the positive, and that's how water is a fluid. But in soils, most of us think about oxygen being the stuff we breathe in the air, but that's bugger all of the oxygen on Earth. About 1/3 of oxygen on Earth is in water, as H2O, but 2/3 of oxygen on Earth is in rocks and is in soils. Okay? So if you start to think about the ending in the word in chemistry of the word ate, A-T-E, at least in English, means saturated with oxygen. So the difference between sulphur and sulfate, S and SO4, nitrogen and nitrate, N, NO3. Now, when you start to think about rocks like carbonate, which is all the limestone in the world, it's 1 unit of calcium, 1 unit of carbon, and 3 units of oxygen. So most people don't look at a rock and think it's mostly oxygen, okay? But it is. Now, what happens is that that gravity that oxygen has for the negative charge is what causes a negative polarity on the surface of clay. And we measure that as what we call cation exchange capacity. How many positive charges can that negative charge hold? Now, what happens is that the positive of the water actually sticks to that negative charge, and then you get that bonding going through. And I gave a little analogy the other day about, on Monday I think it was, about magnets and paper clips. So yesterday we just made it to the store to buy a couple of paper clips and a magnet. What happens is the first water molecule comes on and sticks to that negative charge. That one there is held the tightest. The second water comes along and it sticks as well. Okay, but that's weaker than the first one. It's easier for me to pull that one off than it is to pull that one off. That's the hardest one. Okay. If I get my next one, is that going to stick? That's just sticking there. Okay. That's very easy to get off. Now, if I try to put one more on there, I suspect we're going to have some trouble here. Okay. That's not quite going to stick. And that's where we get drainage of water. So it's reached its saturation point. What's important about that is just that different plants have different capacities to pull off those paper clips. So something like a winter wheat can get that one, but it can't pull off that one. It doesn't have the strength to do that. But something like a summer weed, if you don't control summer weeds, for example, can pull that one off. Now, by the time, that's called a water deficit, okay? So for wheat to be able to start taking water off next season, it's no good if it only gets that much rain, because wheat can't pull that one off. It's actually got to get more rain than that. Okay, well, that one did stick before, but you get the idea. Okay, so in saying that, that's what we're looking at, is how to understand where our water is still in the soil but is unavailable, the water deficits and how we manage water deficits, and how we keep as much water as possible available to the crops that we want. And I guess in all the whole cover cropping story, what we're trying to do is work out how we can get good growth, good diversity, but not eat into the deficit. So what types of plants we choose, we don't want to be choosing the equivalent of summer weeds and really taking all those paper clips off that magnet. Now you see here, I've just got a model up here of humic acid, and people would have heard about humates. Humates is like your organic carbon. We're always thinking about carbon, but it's actually the oxygen in there that's causing the polarity. And that's why humates, you see how many O's are in that? All those O's are what that water's going to bind to, and that's why humic acid can hold 22 times its own weight in water. Okay? So what we do is we have these sensors, and each of these pairs here sends out a little electronic signal, Okay, there's one coming out here, one coming out here, through the soil profile. And basically, the wetter it is, the easier it conducts, so we can produce a trace. But what's interesting in that trace is that we see water go up, and then at night, the transpiration isn't there, so the curve is pretty flat. But during the day, the transpiration occurs and it drops. So we have this night, day, night, day, night, day stepping. So what we can start to do is look at how far water's going into our profile, but also the rooting depth that's occurring in all of that. So looking just here on this graph, we see that there's moisture coming through 10 centimetres, 20 to 30, but we can also start to see the roots coming down. So the roots here at the roots here at 20 centimetres, roots here at 30 centimetres, and then roots here at 50 centimetres, starting to take out water. So a lot of, I guess, we've got some pretty shallow soils, and a lot of people thought, well, my rooting depth is only 40 centimetres. And if we dig down deep, we don't see any roots. But through this type of technology, we've been able to see that we've actually got root systems down to 70 and 80 centimetres, and how we can affect those, and how we can not utilise those. So there's different things there. So again, just looking at the paperclip analogy with these molecules sticking onto the cation exchange, here we've got drainage, so we've got too much water that's going down deeper. Here we have a good string of water, okay, and plenty of available water, to the point here where it's getting tougher, to the point here where we have water stuck to it, but the plant can't actually access it, so we get a flat line, okay? What we see here is that we have some water, a rainfall event, which is giving some moisture up near the top of the surface, and the transpiration at depth actually stops, okay, until this runs out, and then it starts again. So the roots are preferentially taking out moisture, and that's quite important in how we want to manage things. And when we look at our soil moisture profiles and we're thinking about our grain marketing, we want to look in the profile where the water is, because if we know it's down at 70 centimetres, we know that it'll be slow to transpire, and that if there's other rains, it will be protected. So it's almost self-regulated. But in some years, we know the moisture's not there, and we'll talk about that as well just as we move on here. That's called a separate layer graph because it's looking through the profile. If we add them all together, we get what's called a summed graph. So now we're looking at everything added together to be the whole profile. And that allows us to do things where we can do comparisons in time. This is actually where we've got a plant that's in vegetative growth, and at this soil moisture level, because the plant wants to grow, we're seeing lots of transpiration, a big daily step. Each one of those steps is 1 day. You see over here, to go from that same soil moisture level down that it did in 1 day, it's taking 3 days. That's because the plant is now in its reproductive phase. It's naturally transpiring less water, so we can start to understand what the plant's telling us relative to soil moisture. This is actually going into a summer crop, so it's a little bit different, but this is a small plant, so each day it's not transpiring too much. You see the steps are fairly small. It's getting bigger here, but also it's getting hotter. And here it's getting bigger and hotter and bigger and hotter. So we see that in 1 day, that there is transpiring what it nearly took 8 days to transpire over there. So we can start to get a feel for all these things. And like, I guess was part of the message in the introduction is be the master of your own destiny. Get out and understand it. And even if it's bad news, you can make other decisions about input costs, about marketing. Are you going to cut it down for hay, or are you going to let it go through? These type of tools is what allows us to make those type of decisions rather than being literally on a wing and a prayer. This here is a pasture, a hot windy day and 2 cool days. So we can see differences there. Now, I'm going to talk here about 2 graphs in 2007 and 2008 that had basically the same in-season rainfall but had a different soil moisture profile running into the year. Now, I'm just going to focus in here in this period, which is from the 1st of August to the 1st of November. So that's basically that period of the grain filling, that really important spring period. And we had no rain in that period at all in either of those years. In 2008, you can see here that we've got a lot of stepping going on, and in 2007 there's not so much stepping going on. There's not so much transpiration. So in 2008, the overall profile here says we have 20% more moisture. But what takes 9 days to transpire in 2007 only takes 3 days to transpire in 2008. That's because of where that water was positioned. The water in 2008, the bottom part of the profile is all dry. The moisture is all at the top. It's that 10, 20 centimetre level. The plant is just guzzling it away. In 2007, that moisture is down at 60, 70, 80 centimetres. And so it's self-regulated. It's harder for the plant to get it out. And so it can't guzzle it, even if it wanted to. It can't bring it up as fast. And you notice what about those two curves is that the slope of the curve up here in August is not that much different to October. So the plant potential and its ability to get water is the same at the time that it's growing as the same at the time it's filling. But in 2008, the slope here during the potential time is quite steep, but in grain fill, it's basically flat. So we've set a big potential, but we can't fill it. And so what does that give us? In 2007, 2.9 tonnes at 3% screenings, and screenings is a small grain, okay? But in 2008, 4 tonnes sounds great, but at 16% screenings, it's a nightmare. And in that year, in a deregulated grain market, we found people that had pre-sold a couple of thousand tonnes of grain at, say, let's just pick easy numbers, but about, say, $300 a tonne, okay? When they had all those screenings, that price shoots down and everyone in the district has them. And so that price for feed wheat is like $150. But you've got to fill a contract for $300. And the people that do have good plump grain, suddenly that price shot up to $600. So you've got a $450 turnaround on 2,000 tonnes. That will lose your farm quicker than just a drought in its own right. Okay? So these sort of tools are very important to us, and I don't know how many of these tools are out there in the last few years, but literally I think it's in the thousands. Okay, so I'm going to move on from that. As I said, I've only got a bit of time on each thing, but certainly at lunch and later today, I'm more than happy to speak about any of these things in detail to anyone who's interested. Just talking about biochar, the World Bank Economic Research basically says that biochar is the leading land management practice to sequester soil carbon. And in the Africa zone, which is up here, these are a whole lot of different practices, and they can be turning annual crops to perennials, they can be planting trees, they can be pasture management, but biochar came out as the #1 soil carbon accumulation process. But what was important about that too, for every tonne of soil carbon sequestered, what practice actually made the most amount of money? And for each tonne, if we go across here, no-till made the most money per unit of carbon sequestered. And so for us, when we start looking at this data, we're thinking that biochar and no-till probably, if biochar's rated as the #1 soil carbon sequestration method and no-till makes the most money from the unit of carbon sequestered, then putting biochar and no-till together probably makes some sense. Things like, for example, every 1% of increased organic matter is 25,000 gallons of soil water. We will reach a saturation point, and it's very slow to build soil organic carbon. Biochar doesn't degrade, it doesn't reach a point where it's limited by rainfall. You can keep adding it and keep building into the soil. Legend of El Dorado. This guy, Franco Girolamo, was a Spanish conquistador. They went to the Amazonian basin, started hacking up a few people, and decided that it was going to be worthwhile to come back and plunder. By the time he got back there, though, everyone had died of smallpox, and the forest had overgrown the so-called cities that he reported, 30,000, 50,000 people, and they never found the cities again. So I don't know if that's why they poked out his eye or not, but they weren't very happy with him after he came back to Spain, and 5 years later turned up empty-handed with no conquest. But in the 70s and 80s, they started doing aerial surveys all around the world. They started noticing places in this Amazonian basin that clearly weren't natural. The landforms weren't natural, and you can see there's some areas there that have pretty straight geometries, and you can see the difference in the two soils there: a normal Amazonian soil and then what's called the terra preta. So what we want to look at is that if you look on the internet at biochar, people say add 5 tonnes a hectare or 10 tonnes a hectare, but at the price of biochar, you go buy a new farm for that. Right? There's no point in adding those sort of numbers. We want to look at, could we band it in with our fertiliser and get good efficacy that way? And the bottom line is yes. So all of our trials are done. I mean, we're an independent farming organisation, but we still employ an independent contractor who is blind to the trial, so they only see brown paper bags, they don't know what's in them, and they harvest them and seed them that way. We've got a nil treatment here. We have 50 kilos of DAP, so here's a rate of DAP across the bottom and a rate of Cool Terra. Cool Terra is just a biochar. It's just the first biochar in the world to receive a quality certification. So we actually know what we're dealing with. And 50 of DAP and 50 of DAP plus just 35 kilos of biochar per hectare gave us a pretty good yield increase. So much so it's equivalent to 100 of DAP. But if we have 100 of DAP and we keep trying to press it, then we don't get that much more yield because we're in a rain-limited environment. It's not a product that we necessarily see as being to increase yield, but what we do see it as is a way of reducing input cost, because reduced input cost is reduced risk. So that's from 2014, the year just gone. If we go back to 2013, we see exactly the same phenomena. Anneal treatment, 50 of DAP, 50 of DAP plus 35 of biochar, and 50 of DAP. In this case, we had 100 of char, and you see actually we start to come off the boil there. Okay, so it's not a product that more is better. I don't know if you have non-wetting sands here, but some people clay their sands, and you can over-clay them. And I think with biochar, that's the same case. Again, with 100 of DAP, we could lift it with 35, but if we went to 100 and 100, again, we didn't get any more response. So I think it's sort of a case that, that less is better. Some other things that we found with biochar, this is actually a river in Australia in the end of the millennium drought. The whole thing was dry. This is called an acid sulfate soil. This is my footprint, and that's sulfuric acid bubbling up through the soil, and it's mobile, and so it washes into these rivers. And this river here is running at 2.1 pH. So if you go swimming in that, you'll come out like the skeleton man. So what we did is we looked at native revegetation, baling up and making it into char. And the idea was we wanted to make a filter to filter those rivers. And we were contracted to look at to mitigate the pH. And we saw with char, we started at 2.1 and we ended up 6.5. What we weren't looking for, but is really interesting for us, was that the nitrate in that river was 580 parts per million, which is about 12 times the legal discharge limit. And after that, we're only less than 5. So we're capturing all this nitrate on the char. Now, we know that increasing stubble retention increases soil moisture infiltration rates. And this is just a soil moisture graph again, which shows stubble removed in the blue and stubble retained in the dark green. And we see that on any given rainfall, we've got significantly more moisture coming into the profile from the stubble retained. But we thought about that and we thought, well, if we know that the biggest way we lose nitrogen fertiliser is through nitrate leaching, if we're going down a farming system that's actually increasing our infiltration rates of moisture, and we want that to happen because we want this protection against screenings at the end of the year, you know, we want this deep moisture, that self-regulated moisture, we want the water to get down to depth, but aren't we at risk of actually washing more nitrogen out of our system? You know, to give you some rough numbers, there's about 200 million tonnes of anhydrous ammonia produced each year. It's the 4th biggest chemical in the world. About 70% of that goes into fertiliser, and about 40% of that gets lost as nitrate leaching. So it's a big, big loss. At the end of the day, there's all the environmental stuff at the end of the river with that nitrate and the algal blooms, but the bigger part of that is that's 40% of stuff you're buying that you're not using. Okay, so because ammonium, which is this little blue guy here, is positively charged, it tends to stick a bit more to the cation exchange. But nitrate is negatively charged. So it's like two north poles. It gets repelled from the soil, from the cation exchange, and that's why it leaches, and that's why sulfate also leaches really badly. And what we're looking at here is the soil moisture traces across the bottom, but this is iron conductivity. And this is at 10 centimetres and 70 centimetres. And this iron conductivity is mineralisation where stubble is breaking down and ions are forming. Now, as we see the soil moisture here is getting down from 10 to 20, 10 to 20, 10, 20, 30, 50, down to 50 centimetres. You see when the wetting front hits 70 centimetres that there's a massive iron conductivity spike. That's all your nitrate leaving your system, okay? So we thought about that filter and capturing all the nitrate. What we're trying to do is develop a system that can actually infiltrate a lot of moisture but keep the nitrate selectively up in the profile. Now, this is actually a published paper, and this work was actually done in Africa, but here we have nitrate leaching over a 42-day period, and with untreated, by about 20 days into that, all the nitrates leached out of those trials. It's all gone. And at 0.5% of char, we see a reduction of 26% in nitrate. At 2.5% char, we've got a 42% reduction in nitrate leaching. So if we want to keep nitrate in our system, but we want the water to go down, then we believe as a selective filter, that could be of interest to us. Just quickly on biochar though, and why I think there's so much crap biochar out there, is that we have photosynthesis. Okay, so we've got CO2 and water coming together to form basically a sugar called glucose. We can see the carbon, which is in black, the hydrogen, which is the little white balls, and the oxygen, which is the red balls. Now, oxygen is about 40% by weight carbohydrate. When we make char, we tend to get this gas come off, and then this charcoal sort of substance at the bottom where we have a lot of carbon condensation and a little bit of oxygen. What we want to do is retain as much oxygen in that structure as we can. But what happens is that with temperature, the bottom curve here is oxygen content, starting at about 40%, and if we make our char too hot, we won't have any oxygen. So if we've got carbohydrate, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and we drive out all the oxygen, all we've got is hydrocarbon. That's oil. That repels water. Okay, and so you can make hydrophobic type of chars pretty easily if you don't make it at lower temperature. And again, just reiterating that oxygen is what actually is giving all of our holding potential. But the other thing in this, if we just track this little magenta line at the bottom, is that this is surface area. Surface area springs up between 450 and 550 degrees, and we want that surface area. We want that porosity in the system. So basically, if people are making biochar up here, they're actually not getting any more surface area, but they're degrading their oxygen. Here is where it's easy to make biochar. Here's where it's harder to make char. And this is why when people make easy char, that often you put it into trials and it doesn't do too much. So just be aware of that. Just really quickly as well, I guess we've been playing with char since about 2007, but in acid soils, and I know there's not a great deal of acid soils, but we have a few where we are, there's an element called molybdenum. And below 5.5, and especially below 5 pH, molybdenum is unavailable. The plant can't get it. It doesn't matter whether you keep adding it to your soil, it will be unavailable. But molybdenum, here it is. This is the nitronase enzyme. This is the enzyme the rhizobia use to fix nitrogen in all of the legume species. So if you can't get molybdenum, then you can't make the enzyme. And that's why legumes are generally crap in acid soils. Okay? So what we wanted to do was make a alkaline biochar with molybdenum in it. So we put molybdate with the biomass as it went into the machine. And this is on a farmer's property, and Russell just sent me this literally 2 days ago, so I thought I'd throw it up. But if we look at the molybdenum values, this is an untreated. Here's like a molybdenum seed dressing, and we've got 46 there, 52 here, and in the moly char, we've got 950. Okay, so as a delivery mechanism for a nutrient that would normally be unavailable in a bean crop, that bean has got as much molybdenum as it wants. Whether that translates to yield, we'll see that in the next couple of months, what happens there. But if we look at total nitrogen, we've gone, it is the best total nitrogen at this point in time. How significant that'll be remains to be seen. And again, that's only at about 10 kilos per hectare, because you don't actually need too much. So there's that. Okay, just to keep moving and rolling along, Aquatil. Right, now this is some of the stuff people might have already thought I've gone out in a limb, but here we really get out there. That straw you can see there's actually cut with water. Water jets as an industrial tool have been around for plus 20 years, so we're not having to reinvent the wheel, it's about redeploying an existing technology. If you sort of can use your imagination, you can see the front of a seeder. That's actually a slitter machine for making paper and stuff like that. But these pumps run at 55,000 psi, and we're using very small nozzles, things like 7/1000th of an inch type nozzles. The water comes out about 2 to 3 times the speed of sound. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, if we can get this video to work, I'm just using these carrots because it's above ground, you can see what's going on.
This is a 10-thou orifice at 40,000 psi at 1,000 feet a minute. Go, Steve. Whoa, that looked awesome.
Righto, so you can see there it cuts through that pretty easily, and if you think about that being like stubble, it can certainly do a job. So probably in about 2008 we started looking at this and seriously looking at this, could we make it a tool? And we had all the same questions that are probably running through your mind now. How much power is it going to use? How much water is it going to use? All those sort of things, but we'll try to cover over on some of that. You can see at the bottom there's a pretty wet clay, and the stubble on that's been beautifully cut. So we've built a couple of devices, a knife point device, a disc seeding device and a ski. With disc seeding systems, it's actually not the straw that causes as much trouble as the chaffy stuff underneath sometimes, and that's done a beautiful job of cutting through that. You can see in this particular case, this paddock actually has standing water in the paddock. It's really, really quite wet. There's no device that I know that can cut through that straw on that type of soil, that sort of softness. You can see this farmer here, these two farmers here looking at this, I mean, basically they're laughing their heads off because they haven't seen anything cut like that ever. The sort of things that influences the row spacing, the tighter the rows, the more heads you've got, simply the more it's going to cost to operate, okay? How much residue you're trying to cut, the ground speed you're going. Basically, the faster you go, the better, even if that means you have to step up in power and nozzle size. And a big thing that we still think there's a massive opportunities is the ground engagement. Again, like a magnet, if you double the distance of a magnet, you quarter the strength. But if you can get the water jet right down on the stubble, it does a terrific job. If the water jet's hanging up here and the stubble's all loose, it does a crap job. So how we're going to engage that stubble is a real opportunity. This is a 6-tonne wheat stubble, you can see there, that's been cut. And we've brushed one side away. And now looking at the soil, the profile of that. Here, that's about 9 layers deep of straw. Okay, you see the sidewalls are unsmeared, they've still got their structure, and that's about as bad as the hairpinning gets. Okay, so that was sort of, when we started to see these type of results, we thought there's probably something in this. This is running a tine, and this is across a windrow, and that windrow is probably the equivalent of 8 tonnes of stubble. You can see the normal tine, it's bared the ground, you've got these big clumps, but fitted with a water jet, you can sow straight through that. And I guess that opens up a whole world of opportunity for people that don't necessarily want to go to a disc, but want to keep a tine, but want to have increasingly high stubble loads. There's a sunflower stalk being cut. You know those sort of big clumps of chaff you can get, it just whisks through those. Sometimes you get big clumps of straw in the paddock too and it gets through them. This is an interesting one because we've gone through the crown of a plant. This is actually a rice stubble, and rice is probably the toughest of all the cereals that we deal with. But you see the crown of the plant. If that was just a normal tine running through that would have ripped all those roots out of the ground with it. Okay? And we think there's a lot to be said. If we're pre-cutting the soil with the water jet, what that means for soil throw and ground speed, and if we can take a tine seeder from, say, 6 k's an hour to 7 k's an hour, that might not sound a lot, but it's about, whatever that is, 14%, that's out of 1,000 hectares. That's an extra 140 hectares sown at the right time. Penetrates into the soil. There's 2 effects here. One is what I guess we've called the rifling effect. You can sort of see where it's actually cut the soil, but the molecules are still being blasted into the ground through here. It's no longer cutting, but it's still penetrating. Okay. Looking at disc penetration, you can see this disc here is basically only but hairpinning and hardly getting in the ground. You can even see here there's wheels off the ground. The disc with the water jet on is in the ground and no worries. Type of OPEX, I've actually presented these as US dollars per acre. I just wasn't sure what would be the best dollar figure that you could relate to, but obviously you can see here, as we go to wider rows, like this is basically sort of your corn-styled row, you're at about $2 an acre. You come into 20-inch row, which is what we'd like to grow canola on, you're about $3.30 an acre, and as you get to tighter rows, like a 12-inch row, you're starting to get around that $5.30 an acre. So it's going to be a premium product. You see if we go from 5 miles an hour to 8 miles an hour, that all those prices shrink. Even if we go to a larger nozzle size, $2.94 with a larger nozzle, compared to $3.36 slower and a smaller nozzle. They're basically giving us the same cutting power relative to the speed, but it's still cheaper to go faster. I guess when we tried to price out the benefits, we looked at annual production benefits like direct seeding costs and all those sort of things, as well as systems benefits like soil health and erosion control and all those sort of things. And I'm not saying they're all right, but basically we came up with these figures. We have our annual return on investment, our land return on investment. So if we put them together, we had some sort of total benefit. If we look at the various costs to operate, our general rule of thumb within SANTFA is that it's got to be, at least as an operational cost, about 3 times as much to be worthwhile. There's no point in spending $1 to make $1. there's hardly any point in spending $1 to make 2 with other things like droughts and everything else and inefficiencies. We think that nearly everything works though. If you spend $1 and you make 3, generally it works. So these dotted lines are 3 times the red lines, and we think, you know, it looks like it's within a ballpark of providing a good cost benefit. But we think that liquid is probably the biggest limitation in the carrying of liquid. So what we've done is we've tested a whole lot of fertilisers. So instead of cutting with water, let's cut with liquid fertiliser. Anhydrous ammonia, urea ammonium nitrate, ammonium polyphosphate, okay? And I think that's giving us a couple of benefits. One is seedbed utilisation. We're yet to fully understand what the benefit is, but if you imagine upside-down ice cream cone shape going down of dilute, diffuse nutrient all the way down the row, no matter where that seed comes out, it's going to be finding nitrogen, it's going to be finding phosphorus, but there's no big toxic granule, there's no desiccation of the seed, and what that could mean. If we look at our initial trends, we have spent a lot of money looking at nitrous oxide. So we lose nitrogen out of our farming system in 2 ways: nitrate leaching that I mentioned, and the other one is nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is also a significant greenhouse gas. In cropping systems, it's our biggest liability for greenhouse, and nitrous oxide as a gas is about 300 times the greenhouse warming power of CO2. If we look here, there's a couple of different timings that we've got, but the bottom line is, here's a nil treatment in the green, and then we've got our injected, and then we've got our boom spray over the top. Our nitrous oxide profile is lower by injecting it as well. So we're losing less nitrogen and we've reduced our emissions footprint. Talking about liquid rates, and you can see now that there's a big response to our row spacing. So we've got 300 mil, 500 mil, 750 mil, which would be like something like soybean, and 900 mil, which could be corn. At these sort of rates, we're probably at a point where we can't get enough fertiliser out, liquid fertiliser out. When you're sowing corn, you're putting a lot more liquid fertiliser out than that, so that end of it is all good. This end of it's all good. The blue line is probably where we see the maximum amount, and the red line is where we think we can get the technology down to. So at a 500 mil row spacing, something like canola, we're looking at somewhere between, let's say, 90 litres a hectare to about 210 litres a hectare. We would be sowing something like, you know, in times of fertiliser, maybe 120 kilos of fertiliser out with a canola crop in a decent rainfall zone. So if we make that as a liquid and add a little bit of water, we're probably not out of the ballpark. But we don't have to fit out the whole machine either. If you're on wide rows, yeah, sure, fit out the whole machine. But if you have a tighter row spacing, you can fit out just part of the machine. And one example might be, say, in a disc system, we have controlled traffic and GPS guidance, and we know where the header rows are. We know where all the chaff is going to drop. That's basically between the axles of the header. That chaff is what causes the most of the trouble with the disc seeding system. So maybe it's just 6 of these jets in that part of the machine rather than fitting out the whole machine. With a knife point machine, we think that most of the trouble is caused by the back rank. So the back rank, you know, the front rank comes through and it diverts the straw, and the second rank diverts the straw, and it's the last rank that gets it all. But also what happens is that when your first rank sow, the back rank comes through, it can throw soil and chemical from one to the other. And what this data at the bottom is basically showing us via kilometres per hour and different rates of trifluralin how much seedling damage we get. And if we look at the type of seedling damage we get because of soil throw at speed and from that back rank, it can be pretty significant. So maybe just fitting out a back rank can still allow you to go faster. All right, moving on to biomass to energy. Quite a few of our farmers want to increase their diversity. We think that our no-till, dis-till, whatever you want to call it, is actually done pretty well. Our stubble retention is actually going pretty well, but our rotation is still pretty crap. We can only grow stuff we can sell. And one of the biggest limitations in this whole cover cropping thing is, how do I manage the cash flow? Yes, it's going to be good in year 2, year 3, year 4. And so what we looked at was biomass to energy. So in Spain, there's a number of these plants that already exist, but they're basically just baling up straw. That's not what we want to do, but the principle's the same. So basically, we're looking at a project at a place called Ardrossan, which is on the York Peninsula. It's a total spend of about $60 to $100 million, depending on how big we go. The basic business structure is an electricity company that will be generating the power, and a grower cooperative. And that grower cooperative and that electricity company have an exclusive supply agreement. So the electricity company can't go and source its biomass from anywhere else. The electricity produced will be between 7 and 20 megawatts, and the annual tonnage required is 40,000 tonnes to 120,000 tonnes at about a 15% moisture content. The payment, it's not great, but it's $85 a tonne plus a CPI increase locked in, but there's also an internal rate of return incentive. So whenever the electricity plant does better than 12%, let's say it goes to 16% rate of return, that is split between the grower cooperative and the electricity company. So there's the site where we propose to put the plant. We've got major project status, we've got the land locked away, and we're going through the stage at the moment of signing up supply agreements with farmer members. The main things that people are interested in supplying biomass to this plant is what they call bale direct. This is where we bale all the weed seeds in herbicide-resistant paddocks. Now, would we recommend doing this at every paddock every year? Not necessarily. But, for example, if you're trying to do, say, wheat, barley, canola, sowing the canola into the barley stubble is probably the toughest of all of that in the rotation. So keep the wheat stubble and have a weed control mechanism there. Maybe do bale direct over the barley so that it's easier to sow your canola. Okay, something like that. Because the markets for bale direct are pretty limited. The vineyards don't want bale direct stuff. They don't want all the herbicide-resistant weed seeds, mulching around. The nursery businesses don't want it. The only people that probably take it is the chicken sheds. But we have an animal welfare marketing issue that's emerging in Australia, and straw in chicken beds is diminishing. It doesn't hold them. Its moisture management for the chicken's welfare isn't good enough, and people are being forced to move to wood shavings or rice hulls. And so that market that was there is diminishing. So the thing about the biomass to energy plant, which is quite different, if we imagine that we can deliver wheat to a market, and you can deliver as much as you want, all you're going to do is drive down the price. But in this biomass to energy plant, basically it's a fixed amount it can take. But what it does is also provides a 20-year certainty. So you can sign up for 20 years of delivery if you want, which gives you the ability to buy this sort of equipment on a known cash flow. Okay? So in addition to bale direct, the other thing people are interested in is growing big cover crops. Multi-species, 10 species in there, stuff that you can't sell the fodder or the grain to. There's a plant there called sun hemp. If you don't cut that down by first flower, it becomes very difficult to cut. It gets extremely ropey. But it is the world's, as I understand it, the fastest growing legume and the best nitrogen fixer out there, so it's a good thing to put in the mix. But what it also does is promote soil health. CCN, rhizoctonia suppression, all those sort of things. And this is the opportunity potentially in our rotation to bring in this type of diversity to give us that third pillar. So the 3 pillars of conservation ag. Stop banging the crap out of the soil, keep some cover over it, and get good rotation. Okay, so we can get that good soil health going. What it also does is that these sort of crops, maybe you can sow them at different times, because I mentioned before that time of sowing in our system is critical. And so if we can sow some stuff outside of our normal time of sowing, you can actually run a bigger farm with the same equipment. And it also gives opportunities for weed control. So, for example, we've got a couple of guys that are actually not sowing the traditional winter crop and letting all the weeds come up and then terminating those. And then if you could grow something, say putting it in August or September and harvest it by Christmas, be those sunflowers, great. You can get an alternative market, and Tom's going to speak about exactly trying to do that. But that still has a risk in as much as if you have a dry summer, are you going to meet the quality and get enough yield and all those sort of things. But with a biomass to energy crop, it doesn't matter how crap it is. Okay? It doesn't matter how many weeds are in there. It doesn't matter if it's being rained on. If you're trying to export hay and you get rained on, you can lose hundreds of dollars in a night. Whereas this sort of stuff, it's very low in its spec. So can we utilise that to our advantage for weed control, for time of sowing and all those sort of things? And the other one is things like frost and other environmental risks like hail. Being able to take stuff and just bale her up and deliver it. So what I guess our proposition here is do we want this tool in the region? And if the members don't want the tool in the region and we don't get our minimum of 40,000 tonnes, no worries. We had a crack and maybe we try it somewhere else. But But if they do want it, we introduce a new tool which allows us to do things that we could never do with our farming system before. So we don't have to think about renewable energy in the sense of producing biomass for someone else to make money. Use it for our own advantage, for weed control and crop rotation, all those sort of things. Okay. Last thing I'm going to talk about is phosphate. And at the Farmers' Day yesterday, it was mentioned that phosphate's a finite resource that's running out, and that's all pretty true. But also, phosphate can be an environmental disaster, and a lot of phosphate spills around the world, from wastewater treatment plants cause algal blooms and so forth. The other thing that you get inside a wastewater treatment plant is this build-up. And that product there is called struvite, magnesium ammonium phosphate. And what it's doing as it builds up in that pipe is reducing the capacity of the water plant to treat as much water as it should. So, if we could take that phosphate and stop it precipitating out into the pipework and stop it flowing out into the environment, and we get actually a critical crop nutrient back. We turn what's an environmental disaster in just being a good environment, but we're also getting a commercial outcome. So there's a win-win here. And I guess these things have been put in smaller plants. This particular plant's at Rock Creek, which is in Oregon. That's gone in. But it's also now been installed in London and installed in Chicago. They're yet to install anything in the Southern Hemisphere. But what we're trying to do is position our farmer group with the water treatment company so that the time comes that they're looking to install this and they're wondering who's going to take the phosphate, that we're already there. So that some of our farmer members could get into a co-op and buy that direct and stop 14 sets of hands getting in between and putting on extra margin. So the way it works basically is that the water goes through, it precipitates out a ammonium phosphate, and it's a great little product. You can see at the bottom here that it's actually a hard white granule. When we consider all the products that are around from these so-called waste sources, they're often low in nutrients, they're high in bulk density. If you auger them, they fall apart and they're dusty or they block up your machine. This is a hard white granule. It transports well, it goes through machines well, and most importantly, it performs really well. This is looking at both lupins and lentils over a couple of years, and the first bar there is MAP, monoammonium phosphate. The second bar is the trade name for this phosphate recovery technology is crystal green. That's the crystal green. And the last one is because it's primarily phosphate, but MAP has more nitrogen, we've blended a bit of urea to make it the equivalent in units for units, okay? So we've got MAP, straight crystal green, and crystal green with a bit of urea to be the same nitrogen and phosphate as the MAP, okay? And you can see here that it's no worse, and if we add the urea, it's better. Here, in both cases, it's better, okay? So we look back into the 60s, and struvite, which is this trade name, was actually better than DAP and MAP in almost every 1962 research trial out there. It's just that it was much more expensive to make than DAP. So now we can get it in a different way. So again, I guess it's not just about, we're doing a lot in paddocks and soil health and everything else, but I guess part of our organisation is to look at a bigger picture and how we can position ourselves in a world of clean technology, be that the use of a water jet, which has been around for 20 years to cut through stubble and not just thinking about the same old tools. And in 2008, the SANTFA board said to me, we don't want a slightly better tine. We don't want a slightly better disc. We want something that's actually going to really do the job. And I'm not saying the water jet's going to do the job, but that's where we're going. And the same goes with things like the biochar and the struvite here, is that there's an opportunity here. It's an emerging opportunity. Part of my role, I guess, is to be knocking on that door and keeping looking out for these type of things so that when they emerge and we can do the groundwork to say this fertiliser actually works, let's be in the prime position so our members get to that first and can sign that up as a contract. So, thanks a lot for hearing me out. And, if, as I said, any questions, more than happy to speak to anyone at lunchtime or whatever.
Maybe one or two questions. We have finished 10 minutes early.
At this stage, we're not too concerned about that. I guess we would be looking at still some sort of seed device to put the actual seed in the ground. Whether with small seeds like clover and canola, whether we can do that in a completely different way, like an air gun, remains to be seen, and have nothing in the field. I think that also opens up a whole lot of other prospects, is that if we can sow small seeds with no contact through in the field, but we can still get good seed placement, because seed depth is still very important. But we've got to think the water jet as being more of a coulter. And at the end of the day, in say a tine system, it's probably important that it gets a full cut of all the stubble, because the tine will still rake stuff up. But in a disc system, even if we get 3/4 of a cut, then the disc can probably finish it off and still place the seed. But I guess some of the feeling is if we can reduce draft on the machine as a whole. So, for example, with a tine, if you've reduced draft, you don't have as much of this breakout, so you don't have seeds spilling everywhere. If we could have a canola or a clover seeder that had no physical contact with the soil, what does that mean for the frame of that machine, the amount of steel that's in that machine? You're having to run double and triple wheel assemblies on your tractor to drag all this crap through the paddock, and what that means for weeds and compactions, that sort of stuff. So I guess from this point, we're still thinking there's got to be something to deliver the seed depth. As for the fertiliser and how deep that's going to go, we're not too worried about that at this stage. We think that if we actually look at the profile, when it goes down, it has quite a nice slit, and then it starts to spread. And if you look at that in cross-section, it almost looks like where you'd be placing your seed and what the roots would do. So we thought about, do we need to get some sort of radar technology or some sort of sensor technology? And perhaps we can. What we've been thinking about is a technology that can bounce off the stubble on top of the soil, then look through there and get a secondary bounce, like a sonar type of bounce, and be able to say, because our stubble is going to be different thicknesses. Get through the stubble, look at the thickness of the stubble, look at the thickness of the soil, and manage that in real time. So we're working with a company back in Adelaide called Bravo Resource Solutions, and they do sensors, and they can do 220,000 calculations a second. That's really where their expertise is, in the microprocessing of calculations, which allows us to do things on the fly with sensors. How much extra cost and complexity that adds just to saying we don't care about the depth of that because we've still got a tine or a disc placing the seed remains to be seen. But I think if we go to air gun technology for small seeds, we might need to go down that way. But for bigger seeds like faba beans or wheat or what have you, then I think we're still going to be relying on some device. But does that device need to be as thick as our current knife points and stuff like that? So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to a easy question, I guess. But at this point in time, we can control the pressure on the fly if we want. We can't change the nozzle size on the fly, but we can change the pressure. Now, those carrots were cut at 40,000 psi, but the stubble you saw cut was at 55,000 psi. So that will affect the cutting pressure. So if you did want to conserve moisture, you could do those sort of things and actually have a variable speed drive driving your pump.
There's another question.
In what ways did you mix the biochar with the fertilizer, or is it was you not sort of mix or anything?
We didn't mix the molybdenum with the biochar per se. We actually put the molybdate onto the biomass that we made the biochar out of. And if you do it at low temperature, it becomes part of the char. But we have done things we have very alkaline soils as well, like pH 8.5, pH 9, limestone soils. And if you add phosphate into those soils, it locks up as calcium phosphate. So what we did was we got some biochar and put that through a bath of phosphoric acid and then drilled that in. And that gave us really good results as well. But I just didn't want to have, slides of everything we've done. But there's a company in the United States called Cool Planet, and they've developed a technology which is a vacuum application technology. So basically it's adding surfactant, because the surfactant breaks the water tension and you can't get the penetration of fertiliser into all the pores because they're too small and, like an air stone. But with the surfactant under the vacuum technology, you can get complete saturation through there, and their technology allows you to mix and match and apply whatever you want. If my view is that whatever your soil type is, you want to be the opposite with the char. So if you've got an acidic soil, make an alkaline char with alkaline nutrients. If you've got an alkaline soil, make more acidic type stuff. Choose the opposite. And So, yeah, I mean, in our first few years, it was all pretty crude, you know, a bath of stuff and letting it soak in and do whatever. But, yeah, now there's actually good, reliable, automated technologies to do those sort of things.
One more question.
In your phosphate recovery system, in what format is the phosphate recovered as a first question? And the second one, anhydrous nitrate and ammonia is pretty awful stuff. Have you checked what the effect of that is on your microbial populations where you are applying that stuff?
Yeah, look, I'm not a big fan of anhydrous ammonia. I guess at this stage, the reason why we're testing it is because it's still the most used fertiliser in the world. So, you know, you've got to understand your market to a certain extent. But I totally agree that it's, you know, it's not in the bleach cleaner for no reason. Yeah, we want to move away from that. Now, the phosphate in the struvite, in the recovered phosphate, is a magnesium ammonium phosphate. It's still a P2O5 type. But the salt of magnesium ammonium phosphate is much less soluble than, say, for example, DAP. But we thought that would actually reduce its power as a fertiliser. You know, it would be less soluble and therefore, you know, you would have dramas and getting enough phosphate. But we're not seeing that. And the other thing that's interesting about that salt is that it actually has a very low salt index. So the salt index is basically how much water molecules want to come and stick around a given salt as it dissolves. And things like sulfate of ammonia require a lot of water, and that's why it can desiccate seeds quite readily. DAP is less than sulfate of ammonia, but still can be significant. But the struvite is a very, very low salt index. And in zero-till disc systems, we've been able to test the struvite fertiliser in the row with the seed and found that there's no desiccation and there's no seedling loss. So it's slower release, I guess we can measure outcomes. We don't fully understand the mechanism why something with such a low salt index and such low solubility seems to be so readily available to the plant. And that's it's something in its own right. We've measured the outcome, but I can't say we understand the mechanism of why that's the case.
There will be some time for some more questions right at the end of today, just before we have lunch. Just two quick things. We're going to have some tea and coffee now. Those of you who have not signed in on the register sheets, please do so now, so that we could get an accurate count, please. And then see you back we'll promptly start at 25 past.